Megan Basham, the Daily Wire entertainment reporter, has been doing such a great job covering the culture that I've decided we're going to bring her on. She's agreed happily that we can bring her on once a month to talk about the stuff she is covering. She is the author of Beside Every Successful Man. Megan, thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm over the moon about it.
Well, that last time that my last cultural reporter was Michael Knowles, so you've got to be an improvement there. And but he, he did well, so maybe
he does okay for himself. Yeah,
he does. So before you came on, when they were trying to hook up the link, I just went on Twitter, and I see you being beaten up by the Evangelicals, which is really funny. It's hilarious the way, because you keep producing the receipts. They keep saying they didn't do it, and you keep producing the receipts. So the story basically centers around Francis Collins. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so before you get to what the story was, explain to people not just who Francis Collins is, but what he has meant to the evangelical movement.
So Francis Collins was, until recently, the head of the National Institutes of Health. He ran the Human Genome Project. And so he's really a celebrated scientific mind. He's also noted for being a professing Christian. He identifies as an evangelical. Now, some of his beliefs are a little outside of Orthodox Christianity. He's something of a theist. He doesn't believe in a literal Adam and Eve. He's kind of in the camp where he believes that God started the evolutionary process and kind of let things unfold from there, but that God had a hand in that evolutionary process. So I think a lot of the evangelical world has this sense of maybe inferiority, that we're not intellectuals, that we are not that smart. And so you have someone like Francis Collins, and I think there's an understandable desire to hold him out and say, this guy, this amazing intellectual, is one of us. And so he runs in a lot of Tony circles. He was appointed by Obama. He holds a very powerful position in the federal government until just last December, when he retired. And he goes to places like Davos, and he does book clubs with David Brooks at the New York Times. So just, a very fancy man.
He's a Christian who's accepted by the elites, basically.
Yes, I think that's a great way to put it. And so as COVID has been going on, he's particularly been important for his pushing of the COVID narrative. So just as you saw Anthony Fauci out everywhere in the secular media, Francis Collins has been specifically dispatched, and this wasn't really denied. It was kind of openly covered in Time magazine and some other outlets, that he was openly dispatched to convince Christians and church members to get on board with the government's COVID policies, things like masking, shutting your churches, staying home, abiding by lockdowns, and especially getting vaccinated, all of those things. So he made the rounds to just a number of very high-profile pastors, high-profile media outlets and ministries, sort of preaching this message of follow the government guidelines regarding COVID. And very particularly, he presented it as a gospel issue. Follow the guidelines to show that you love your neighbor, to show that you're following Jesus. And he was presented in that way as someone who is just like you, a Christian brother, and that's why you should listen to him. So that was kind of the nature of the story. But there's a little bit more to Francis Collins than that. And that was the part of the story that was not presented on all of these podcasts and in all of these media interviews. And that's the fact that Francis Collins, though he professes to be pro-life, has directed record level funding to fetal tissue research. And that has included some experimentation at the University of Pittsburgh that involved grafting the scalps of aborted infants onto lab rats. It involved harvesting the organs of full-term babies, 42 weeks, that had been aborted. There were some charges. This is not confirmed, but some doctors have alleged that University of Pittsburgh research involved extracting the ureters, kidneys, and a couple other organs from still living infants. So some fairly horrific stuff. So to wrap up this somewhat long-winded answer, there's also another element of Francis Collins's work, and that is the fact that he launched an initiative in which he declared himself an LGBT ally and advocate. And that funding went to something called sexual and gender minority research. And one of those projects has involved directing $8 million to a research grant that gave opposite-sex hormones to children as young as 8 and mastectomies to girls as young as 13. So these are the things that all of these pastors and Christian ministries did not tell their audiences and their church members about Francis Collins.
Did they know it?
I don't know. And so I reached out to try to find that out. I mean, his record on fetal tissue research is pretty public. He's given lots of interviews where he has advocated for it and admitted that he knows it's controversial in the pro-life world. So I suspect they did know that. I don't know if they knew about the sexual and gender minority research.
And so you called Collins for comment. What happened?
Well, I called everyone for comment.
Okay.
I called all the pastors. And Collins, I had an interview scheduled with, and it was actually coincidental that after our article came out on the Daily Wire, one of these PR companies got in touch with me and said, we're doing this, curriculum launch with Francis Collins. Would you like an interview with him? And it happened to fall like 2 days after the article came out. So I said, oh, yes, please. I would love that interview. So interview was scheduled via Zoom. And I just want to say that I did read through all the press materials, and all of my questions were crafted to be related to those press materials and the topic at hand. So I'm sitting there waiting for our Zoom meeting, and some time goes by. They're running late. They're telling me not to worry. At about 15 minutes, my Zoom screen clicks off and says this meeting has been canceled. And I just get a text from the PR people saying, we're sorry, we had to cancel the meeting. They don't answer me for a little while. Eventually, I get an email from his people saying, because your article does not exhibit the kind of gracious tone that we are trying to elevate with Francis Collins's organization, we had to cancel your interview. So that was kind of the end of my story with Francis Collins.
So one of the most powerful bureaucrats in the country, he ran away from a girl, is what you're telling me, like this guy.
That is what I'm telling you. Yes, that's what happened.
I mean, when I found Christ, he made me weirdly fearless. It seems like it didn't have that effect on this guy. Just to go back for a minute to whether these guys knew, one of the guys he was with, and from your articles, N.T. Wright. Now, I've read a lot of N.T. Wright, and he's a very, very elevated Christian intellectual. I think he's overrated, but I don't think he's completely overrated. I think he's got some interesting stuff that he does. But they were pals, right? I mean, they knew each other pretty well.
Oh, yes. I mean, all of these guys seem pretty close. The N.T. Wright interview in particular ended with a guitar duet where they sang together. So I feel like that's a pretty tight connection when you're doing a duet with somebody. That's like Knowles and Boring, right?
So now, just, on a personal note, just before the pandemic, I for a while left the kind of Anglican Catholic Church because I got so disgusted with the church I was in because it was so left wing that I was distracted by some of the sermons, and I wound up in a Presbyterian church, which I kind of enjoyed, but ultimately when they called for a shutdown, they shut down like this. And I was really disappointed. And these guys, in your article, you say these guys were making fun of John MacArthur, the guy who braved California's lockdown to stay open and fought them. And they were kind of chuckling at him behind his back, essentially.
Yeah, which is kind of funny to me because now I'm hearing all this stuff about my tone, and I kind of look at these videos and go, gosh, you guys, I like Tim Keller. I feel probably about Tim Keller like you do about N.T. Wright. I've learned a lot from him. I like him too. Yeah. Yes, I've benefited from his writing. But in this particular interview, he was right there agreeing with Francis Collins. In fact, he said that churches who defied the COVID shutdowns, like John MacArthur's, and this was right at that time, represented the bad and ugly of good, bad, and ugly church responses to the coronavirus. So, and N.T. Wright said that these churches that were not locking down had some idea like Jesus is my vaccine or Satan can't get into my church. So really dismissive and kind of sneering. So
what bothers me about this, the fact that the government says shut down your church in a country like this where the government really is not supposed to have that power, and they shut down like this. And, it's not just the evangelicals, because in, Catholic theology, the body and blood of Christ, the Mass is central. If you're not getting the Mass, you are not getting the benefit of the church. They shut down instantaneously. Meanwhile, as you say, they're listening to this guy who is, supporting gender treatment for kids and possibly some level of abortion. this speaks to me of something horribly wrong in the church. Am I getting that right? Am I seeing that correctly?
Yeah, I think you are. And what's been probably most disturbing to me, I didn't know what the reaction would be when the story came out, but I thought there would be some. I thought there might be some argument of, look, given what we knew at the time, we felt this was the best thing to do, or we stand by our mask decision, something like that. I've gotten none of that. All I've really gotten is some sort of back channel through ancillary voices like Eric Erickson, who I like, also conservative host, saying, hey, guys, I talked to them. He doesn't say who he talked to, but he just says, I talked to them. They're good guys. This is more complex than you think, but doesn't really offer detail. And then the whole thing turns into tone. Let's not fight. Let's not have this bickering and backbiting. We need to love each other. And I'm going, okay, at a certain point, though, we actually need to talk about the hard, concrete facts of this story, and we need to get to the truth. And so I'm not really willing to brush it all under the rug, under the umbrella of nice tone.
So do you have an idea, a larger idea of what you think has gone wrong? I mean, something, these churches, people are deserting them. And a church that bows to the government is not the church. We know this because, we have all of church history from literally the year zero, of churches standing up to oppressive governments and governments that are overstepping. And certainly in terms of operating on children, I mean, there's no excuse. There's just no excuse. So,
right.
So do you have a bigger idea of what's gone wrong? What happened to the evangelical church? It was a force for conservatism. It was a force sometimes for actual religion, and it seems to have lost its way.
I mean, from my perspective, and at this point, this is not reporting, this is my opinion because They wouldn't talk to me, but I see this desire for cultural relevancy, and it feels like it infects so much of what they do. Like, somebody kind of made the quip that evangelicalism is, we'll do the same thing, but worse, and 5 years later. And that kind of feels like what we're seeing. It's just this very strong desire to be associated with people who are viewed as elite, intellectual, and we want to be culturally relevant. We don't want to be thought as backwoods and backwards. But you know what? If you follow Jesus, they might think that you're backwoods and backwards. Yeah.
No, it's very corrupting. It's something, in some ways they joined the Reagan coalition basically because I think partly because of Roe v. Wade, they felt they were being excluded, but now they've become part of power politics, and it's just not a good fit. I mean, you're going to be corrupted by power politics. This is probably my last question, and it is an opinion question. But I read recently in a book called Homo Deus by Yuval Harari, I read this line where he said, Christianity and the other theist religions have long since turned from creative into reactive forces. And I can't help feeling that he's got something there, even though I disagree with a lot of what Harari says, that somehow churches are no longer part of the conversation of how should we live? How should we deal with mental illness? How should we deal with art? How can we create art that matters? None of those things that the church actually did for most of its existence happen anymore in this country. They have become a sort of a crank fest sometimes, or they just surrender to the culture, or they just crank about it. Do you have any thoughts about why that should be?
Well, I have to be honest with you. I have felt that way for maybe the last 10 years. And then as much as we all sort of decry the effects of social media, lately I've been connecting with sort of these young, they dismiss them as Theo bros, but there's kind of these very young, strong Christian men who are talking about some really big ideas. And I've kind of been hanging out in their Twitter spaces and listening to them talk about natural law and the application of the common good. And I kind of feel like maybe the tide is turning and there's been a bit of a backlash to where they're going, no, we are here to have an impact on culture, and we're not willing to just sort of follow along and look for contextualization or relevancy where we can find it. So for me, I think that has happened, but I'm kind of hoping maybe we're reaching a tipping point because these young guys, they're not messing around.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear. I'm glad I asked the question. That is excellent to hear. Megan Basham, the excellent cultural reporter for the Daily Wire. It is great to see you, and we will see you again in March.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks a lot.